Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that would assault your senses the moment you arrived. A world where the air itself was thick with something you couldn't wash away. Imagine walking through a medieval city on a warm summer morning. You'd smell it before you saw anything. The streets were open sewers. Chamber pots emptied from second-story windows with barely a warning shout. Human waste flowed in channels down the center of cobblestone lanes, mixing with animal dung from horses, pigs, and cattle that wandered freely. Butchers tossed entrails and blood into the streets. Tanners soaked hides in urine and dog feces to cure leather, the chemical stench drifting across entire neighborhoods. Every guild had its own signature smell. The fuller's workshop reeked of stale urine used to clean wool. The fishmonger's stall carried the sweet rot of yesterday's catch. Candlemakers melted animal fat in great vats, releasing clouds of greasy smoke that clung to your clothes and hair. And the people themselves. Most medieval Europeans bathed perhaps once a month, if that. Water was precious, heating it was labor-intensive, and the church had complicated feelings about nakedness, even your own. Clothing was worn for weeks without washing. Undergarments absorbed sweat, skin oils, and the general grime of daily labor. Wool garments held odors like a sponge holds water. Linen shirts turned yellow under the arms. Leather belts and shoes absorbed body odor and never quite dried out. Women's long dresses dragged through those street gutters we mentioned, picking up waste that dried into the fabric. Men's hose developed their own ecosystem of smells after days of wear. But here's the thing that's hard for modern minds to grasp. You'd stop noticing. Your brain would adapt. The smell that would make a time traveler vomit would simply become the background of existence. Like how you stop hearing the hum of your refrigerator. It was just air. Scientists today call this olfactory adaptation. Your nose has receptors that stop firing when exposed to constant stimuli. What's unbearable for 5 minutes becomes invisible after an hour. Medieval people lived in that adapted state permanently. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly didn't notice, or whether they simply accepted it as unchangeable reality. We know they used herbs and flowers to mask odors. Wealthy homes scattered rushes mixed with lavender on floors. Pomanders filled with spices hung from belts. But these were perfumes layered over the foundation smell, not replacements for it. The wealthy had it slightly better. Private latrines instead of public gutters. Servants to empty chamber pots discreetly. Access to imported soaps and scented oils. Yet even in castles, the garderobes, medieval toilets, were just stone seats with holes dropping waist-down shafts into moats or pits below. The smell rose back up, especially in summer. Castle kitchens were often built separately from main halls specifically because the cooking smells, mixed with rot from food storage, became overwhelming. One eccentric detail that captures this world. Some medieval doctors genuinely believed bad smells could prevent plague. They'd recommend inhaling the odor of latrines as protection. Thinking foul air drove out fouler air. So people would literally stick their faces near open sewers as a health measure. The miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad smells, dominated medical thinking. Ironically, they were surrounded by bad smells constantly and still got sick, but the theory persisted for centuries. The City of London finally banned throwing waste into the Thames in 1357, though enforcement was a joke. Paris had similar laws. Both cities continued to reek for centuries afterward. Medieval travelers wrote about it. A Venetian visiting London described the smell as an assault upon the nostrils. But Londoners themselves barely mentioned it in their daily writing, because to them, it was normal. Churches burned incense, partly for spiritual reasons, partly to mask the smell of unwashed congregations packed together. In summer, those wooden pews absorbed generations of human odor. You taste it too. The smell was so pervasive it flavored food, settled on your tongue. Every meal came with a side of ambient stench. Bread baked near tanneries carried hints of the curing pits. Ale brewed in homes absorbed the smell of the family's living space. Even honey, that precious sweetener, came from hives kept near human settlements with all their associated odors. Children born into this world knew nothing else. The smell was as natural as birdsong. Old people couldn't remember a time before it. Babies took their first breaths in rooms where chamber pots sat in corners. They nursed while surrounded by the smell of their mother's unwashed body, their father's work clothes, the straw bedding, composting beneath them. And they grew up thinking this was simply how the world smelled. Imagine never knowing the scent of fresh laundry, never experiencing that clean feeling after a hot shower, never walking into a room and thinking this smells nice. That absence was medieval normal. Even romance happened in this context. Courtship, marriage, intimacy, all conducted by people who hadn't bathed in weeks, wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in longer. And nobody thought it was strange. And at night, when you finally lay down to sleep, your own body's odor mingling with your family's, the straw mattress beneath you composting slowly with each sleeper's sweat, the chamber pot in the corner waiting for morning. That was just home. That was safety. That was love, even. So before you get comfortable tonight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing this community spans the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world is waiting, and it smells like nothing you can imagine. Yet somehow they call it home. You just traveled 20 miles on foot. Your legs ache. Your stomach growls. Darkness is falling fast. You need shelter for the night. The inn appears ahead, timber-framed and crooked, smoke rising from its chimney. You push open the heavy door, grateful for warmth and the promise of rest. The innkeeper nods. You pay your penny. He points upstairs. You climb the narrow stairs, duck through a low doorway, and enter a room with 3 large beds. Each bed already holds 2 or 3 people. Strangers, sleeping, snoring. The innkeeper gestures to an empty space on the nearest bed. This is your spot for the night. You'll be sharing a mattress with people whose names you'll never know. This was completely normal in medieval Europe. Beds were expensive. Entire beds, with their wooden frames, straw mattresses, and woolen blankets, represented significant wealth. Most inns couldn't afford private rooms for every traveler. So they maximized space the only way that made economic sense. Communal sleeping. A typical inn bed measured perhaps 6 feet wide. Medieval people were generally shorter than modern humans, but still, fitting 4 or 5 adults across that space meant bodies pressed together. You'd lie down fully clothed because undressing among strangers wasn't done. Your cloak became your blanket. Your bag became your pillow, clutched close so no one could rob you in the night. And then you try to sleep, next to people you'd never seen before and would never see again. The person beside you might be a merchant, a pilgrim, a laborer seeking work in the next town, a criminal fleeing justice. You had no way to know. Historians still argue whether this arrangement led to frequent theft, violence, or worse. Records suggest it was surprisingly rare, perhaps because everyone was in the same vulnerable position, creating an unspoken truce. But it did happen. Medieval court records mention cases of travelers robbed, assaulted, or murdered by the strangers they shared beds with. Women traveling alone faced particular dangers, though many inns tried to separate male and female sleeping areas. Still, the system persisted for centuries because the alternative was worse. Sleeping outside meant exposure to weather, wild animals, and bandits. The slight risk of a dangerous bedfellow was preferable to the certain risk of the open road at night. One eccentric detail, medieval etiquette manuals actually included rules for bed sharing with strangers. Don't sprawl. Don't snore if you can help it. Don't scratch yourself excessively. If you must get up to relieve yourself, disturb your bedmates as little as possible. These rules existed because the situation was common enough to require guidance. Imagine the sounds. 5 people breathing in different rhythms. Someone coughing, another grinding their teeth. The rustle of fabric as someone shifts position, pulling the shared blanket and waking everyone else. The smells too. Remember that from earlier. Medieval bodies unwashed for weeks, packed together under wool blankets in unventilated rooms. The warmth was probably welcome on cold nights. Human bodies generate heat. 5 people in close quarters could make a freezing room almost comfortable. But in summer, that same warmth became oppressive, and there was no escape. You paid your penny. The bed was your right for the night. You couldn't demand better accommodations. There weren't any. Children learned this custom early. Families traveling together would still end up sharing beds with strangers because in rooms rarely accommodated whole families privately. A child might fall asleep pressed between their mother and a complete stranger on the other side. This was their introduction to travel, to the world beyond their village. The rich had it slightly better. Wealthy travelers could sometimes pay for an entire bed to themselves or even a private room. But this was luxury, not standard. Most people, even minor nobility, accepted communal sleeping as the price of mobility. Monasteries operated similarly. Pilgrims seeking shelter at religious houses slept in large common rooms. Dozens of people lined up on simple pallets or shared beds. The monks believed they were providing Christian charity. The pilgrims were grateful for anything better than dirt and rain. Nobody questioned the arrangement. Ships were even worse. On medieval vessels, passengers slept wherever they could find space on deck or in the hold. Bodies crammed together, rolling with the waves, seasick and miserable. At least the in-bed didn't move. Think about the trust required. Every night, closing your eyes next to strangers, hoping you'd wake up with your belongings intact and your throat uncut. Most people did wake up fine. The strangers beside them were just other tired travelers, wanting sleep as much as anyone. But the possibility was always there. That uncertainty, that vulnerability was just part of travel. Morning came. You'd wake stiff and unrest, climb over your bedmates who were still sleeping, and continue your journey. You'd never see those people again. They were just warm bodies in the dark. Anonymous participants in a nightly ritual repeated in every inn across Europe. Some travelers developed strategies. Sleep with your back to the wall, if possible. Keep your knife accessible, but not threatening. Choose bedmates who look least dangerous, if you have any choice. But mostly you just accepted it. This was how the world worked. The bed was a shared resource like the road itself. You took your space, respected others' space, and hoped for morning. And when morning came, you'd step back into your separate lives, strangers once more. The intimacy of the night, bodies touching, breath mingling, the vulnerability of sleep dissolved with the dawn. You'd nod perhaps, a brief acknowledgement, then out the door into your own path forward, as if you'd never shared anything at all. You wake one morning with a dull ache in your back teeth. Nothing terrible, just a slight throb that comes and goes. You ignore it. There's work to do, fields to tend, bread to bake, wool to card. The ache doesn't leave. By the third day, it's sharper, a precise point of pain that flares when you chew. You start favoring the other side of your mouth. By the end of the week, the pain is constant, a deep, gnawing presence that never quite disappears. Your jaw feels swollen. The tooth is darker now. You can see it when you probe with your tongue, and there's nothing you can do about it. No dentist exists, no antibiotics, no root canals or fillings, or any of the interventions that modern people take for granted. You have a rotting tooth, and it will rot until something changes. Medieval people lived in absolute terror of tooth decay, and with good reason. A cavity wasn't an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. The pain came first. That relentless ache that made eating torture, speaking difficult, sleeping nearly impossible. It could last for months. Months. The tooth would continue decaying, the cavity deepening, until the nerve was exposed. Then the real agony began. Sharp, electric jolts of pain at the slightest touch. Cold water felt like a knife. Warm food was unbearable. Even breathing through your mouth sent shocks through your jaw. People described it as the worst pain imaginable, worse than broken bones or childbirth. And it just kept going. Eventually, if you were fortunate, the nerve would die. The pain would fade to a dull, constant ache. But that didn't mean you were safe. The infection would spread into the root, into the jawbone, into the soft tissues of your face. Abscesses formed, pockets of pus swelling under the gum, distorting your face, making it painful to open your mouth. Your breath would smell like rot, sweet and putrid at once. People could smell you coming before they saw you. Historians still argue about mortality rates from dental infections, but evidence from skeletal remains is clear. Many medieval people died with active abscesses in their jaws. The infection could spread to your brain, to your heart, to your blood. Sepsis didn't have a name then, but it was common. Fever, chills, confusion, then death. All from tooth. One eccentric detail that captures the desperation. Medieval dentists, really just barbers with pliers, would sometimes pull healthy teeth by mistake because the patient couldn't accurately point to which tooth hurt. The pain radiated. Infected molars made your whole jaw throb. People would beg to have multiple teeth pulled, just hoping one of them was the right one. And pulling teeth was its own horror. No anesthesia. Maybe some wine to dull the senses. Someone hold you down. The barber would grip the tooth with metal pliers and pull. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly. Often it shattered, leaving infected roots embedded in the jaw. That could make things worse. The extraction site could become infected too. Now you had an open wound in your mouth, exposed to all the bacteria that lived there, which was considerable given medieval hygiene. Some people died from the extraction itself, bleeding that wouldn't stop, or infection that spread faster than the body could fight it. So you faced a choice: live with the agony and risk of the infected tooth, or risk the agony and danger of having it pulled. Many people chose to simply endure it. They lived with rotten teeth for years. Their smiles were landscapes of decay, brown stubs, missing teeth, swollen gums. By middle age, most people had lost several teeth. By old age, many were nearly toothless. This changed what they could eat. Hard bread became impossible. Meat had to be boiled soft. Apples were a luxury of youth. The elderly survived on porridge, pottage, and anything else that required no chewing. Sugar made it worse, but sugar was rare. The medieval European diet was rough on teeth in other ways. Grain ground with stones left tiny bits of grit and flour. Every bite of bread was slightly abrasive, wearing down enamel over decades. But the real killer was simple decay. Bacteria living in the mouth, feeding on food particles, producing acid that ate through tooth enamel. Without brushing, and most people didn't brush, those bacteria thrived. Some medieval people did try to clean their teeth. Rough cloths rubbed on teeth. Twigs chewed to fray the ends into primitive brushes. Mixtures of herbs and salt used as tooth powder. But these methods were inconsistent at best, and many people did nothing at all. Why bother when everyone's teeth were rotting anyway? Children lost baby teeth and gained adult teeth just like today. But those adult teeth were all they'd ever have. A cavity in a 7-year-old's molar meant a lifetime of problems. Parents watched their children's teeth decay and felt helpless. There was no prevention, no cure, no hope, just the slow certainty of deterioration. Rich people suffered too. Even royalty dealt with tooth decay. Elizabeth I, centuries later, would have black rotted teeth. Medieval nobility was no better off. Money couldn't buy healthy teeth when the knowledge didn't exist. You'd see people in their 20s with mouths like elderly people today. You'd see children crying from toothaches that would never fully heal. And everyone just accepted it. The pain was part of life. Like hunger. Like cold. Something you endured because there was no alternative. At night, when the throbbing in your jaw kept you awake, you'd press a hand to your face and wait for dawn, hoping tomorrow the pain might ease just a little, knowing it probably wouldn't. But what else could you do? You'd live with it until you couldn't anymore, until the infection spread too far, or the tooth finally fell out on its own, or you died of something else first. That was the best you could hope for. A different pain, a different death, anything but the tooth. You're sitting down to your evening meal, a wooden bowl of pottage, a chunk of dark bread. The food is simple but filling. You're grateful for it. You eat, talking with your family about the day's work. Someone mentions the neighbor's new pig. Your daughter complains about her chores. Normal conversation. Normal life. Then you feel it. A slight movement. Internal. Something shifting in your belly that isn't quite you. You pause mid-bite, but the feeling passes. You keep eating. Later that night, squatting over the chamber pot or the latrine pit, you glance down out of habit. And there it is. A worm. Long, pale, moving slightly in your waist. You stare for a moment. Then you stand, adjust your clothing, and go back to bed. Because this is normal. Everyone had worms. Not some people. Not most people. Everyone. Intestinal parasites were so universal in medieval Europe that seeing them in your stool was barely worth mentioning. Roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, pinworms, whipworms. Your body was home to multiple species of parasites, all living in your intestines, feeding on what you ate, reproducing inside you. They'd been there so long you couldn't remember a time without them. Modern people find this horrifying. Medieval people found it ordinary. Children were infected young, usually by age 2 or 3. They'd play in dirt contaminated with human waste, put dirty hands in their mouths, eat food prepared by people who'd never heard of hand washing. The parasite eggs were everywhere. In the soil, on vegetables, in the water. Once inside, they hatched, grew, matured, started producing thousands of eggs that you'd excrete, continuing the cycle. A single roundworm could live in your intestines for a year or more. Some tapeworms live for decades. You carried them your entire life. The symptoms were so common, nobody connected them to the worms. Stomach aches? Everyone had those. Chronic fatigue? That was just life. Malnourishment despite eating? Well, food was scarce anyway. Children with swollen bellies, a classic sign of heavy worm burden, were just considered poorly fed, which was true in a way. The worms were eating their food from the inside. Historians still argue about how much parasites contributed to medieval life expectancy and general health. Some suggest the constant drain of nutrients made people more susceptible to disease, less able to work, more likely to die young. Others point out that everyone survived with worms, so they couldn't have been that bad. Both can be true. One eccentric detail: medieval medical texts mention worms casually as a fact of life rather than a treatable condition. If a patient complains of belly worms, give them bitter herbs to drive them out. Sometimes this worked, temporarily. The worms would die or be expelled. You'd see them in the chamber pot, sometimes dozens at once, a writhing mass. Then you'd be reinfected within weeks. The herbs didn't prevent new worms. Nothing did. So why bother? Many people didn't seek treatment at all. The worms were just there, like your liver, your lungs. Internal residents you couldn't see most of the time, except when you could. Tapeworms were the worst for visibility. They grew long, sometimes 20 feet or more, living in segments that would break off and pass in your stool. You'd see these white, rice-like segments moving in your waist, sometimes still alive, contracting slowly. Children would sometimes vomit up roundworms if the infestation was heavy enough. The worms would crawl up from the intestines, out through the mouth. Imagine your child vomiting a living worm. Medieval parents would clean their child's face, dispose of the worm, and consider it an unfortunate but unremarkable incident. Because what else could they do? Pinworms were different, smaller. They lived in the lower intestines and came out at night to lay eggs around the anus. This caused intense itching. Everyone knew that itch. Children scratched constantly. Adults scratched more discreetly. The scratching spread the eggs to hands, to bedding, to food. The cycle continued. Whole families shared the same pinworm populations. You'd give them to each other over and over, an intimate exchange nobody discussed. The rich had worms too. Examining the remains of Richard III revealed he'd had roundworms. Medieval royalty, for all their privilege, couldn't escape this particular indignity. Because the worms didn't care about status. They cared about finding a warm human intestine to call home. And every human intestine was welcoming. The medieval diet actually helped the worms. Poorly cooked meat, especially pork, transmitted tapeworms. Unwashed vegetables carried eggs. Contaminated water harbored larvae. Every meal was a potential infection. People who worked in fields fertilized with human waste, which was most farmers, had constant exposure. They'd spread the waste on crops, step in it, touch their faces, eat lunch without washing hands. The worm eggs entered through 100 pathways. Some parasites caused more obvious problems. Hookworms burrowed into feet when people walked barefoot in contaminated soil, then traveled through the bloodstream to the lungs, were coughed up and swallowed, finally settling in the intestines. The journey took weeks. The infection lasted years. Hookworms fed on blood, causing anemia. People grew pale, weak, breathless, but they didn't know why. The worms were invisible until they weren't. You couldn't feel them moving most of the time. They were just a weight you carried, literally. Some adult roundworms weighed nearly a pound collectively. That's a pound of living parasites in your belly, taking your food, producing waste inside you, living their entire life cycles in your gut. And you went about your day, worked your job, raised your children, went to church, fell in love, felt joy and sorrow, all while hosting these uninvited guests. At night, lying in your straw bed, you might feel them moving, a shifting sensation deep in your belly, like your intestines were rearranging themselves. Sometimes they were, but you'd roll over and go back to sleep. What else was there to do? Everyone had worms. Your parents had them. Your children had them. Your neighbors, your priest, your lord, everyone. It was just another fact of medieval existence. Like hunger, like cold, like that tooth pain we talked about earlier. Something you lived with. Something you died with often. The worms would survive in your corpse for a while, until decay made your body uninhabitable even for them. Then they die too. Temporary residents in a temporary home, just trying to survive like you. The sun sets earlier each autumn evening. You finish your work in fading light, hurrying to complete tasks before the darkness arrives. Because once it comes, it's total. You've never experienced true darkness if you've lived your whole life with electricity. Street lights, car headlights, the glow of buildings, light pollution washing out the stars. Even your bedroom at night. There's the LED on your phone charger, the digital clock, the ambient light from outside seeping through curtains. Medieval people knew a darkness you cannot imagine. When the sun went down, the world disappeared. No streetlights, no lit windows along the road, no distant glow from the next village. Just black, an absolute, impenetrable darkness that swallowed everything. If you stepped outside on a moonless night, you literally could not see your hand in front of your face. People didn't go out after dark unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't just the darkness itself. It was what the darkness hid. You couldn't see the ground beneath your feet. Stepping wrong meant a twisted ankle, a fall into a ditch, a collision with a wall you didn't know was there. Streets that you walked confidently during the day became alien landscapes at night. The village you'd lived in your entire life became unfamiliar and threatening. Inside wasn't much better. A single candle was expensive. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but smoked terribly and smelled of burning meat. Beeswax candles burned cleaner but cost more than most people earned in a day. So you rationed light carefully. One candle for the entire family, placed centrally, creating a small bubble of dim, flickering illumination. Beyond that bubble, darkness. The corners of your own home disappeared into shadow. You knew the furniture was there, but you couldn't see it. Children learned to navigate by memory, hands outstretched, feeling their way in the dark. Historians still argue about how this shaped medieval psychology, whether living in such darkness made people more fearful, more imaginative, more reliant on non-visual senses. Certainly it shaped their stories. Demons and monsters always came at night, not just in tales, but in the actual experience of darkness. Your mind filled the blackness with possibilities. That sound outside, was it wind? An animal? Something worse? You couldn't look to check. Looking meant nothing. The darkness was opaque. One eccentric detail. Medieval people divided night into segments marked by church bells or the night watchman's calls. Not because they could see clocks, but because time itself became invisible in the dark. You needed sound to orient yourself temporally. 3 hours past Compline meant something specific to people who lived by such markers. But between the bells, you simply existed in darkness, with no sense of how much night remained. Wealthy homes had more candles. Multiple rooms lit simultaneously. The luxury of moving from one lit space to another. But even castles were mostly dark. Long corridors stretching into blackness. Stairways where you counted steps by memory. Servants carrying candles carefully, shielding flames from drafts. One candle extinguished meant being stranded in absolute darkness until someone came to help. Winter was worst. Darkness fell by late afternoon. Didn't lift until mid-morning. That's 16 hours of night. 16 hours of huddling near the hearth, if you could afford to keep it burning, in a small circle of firelight. The fire helped, but fire gives less light than you'd think. It illuminates faces nearby, casts dramatic shadows, but doesn't fill a room with light the way a lamp does. Beyond the hearth's immediate glow, more darkness. People went to bed when darkness fell, because what else was there to do? You couldn't read, even if you were literate, which most weren't. You couldn't sew or do detailed work. You could talk, but conversation in the dark has a different quality. Disembodied voices, faces barely visible. So you slept. Long hours of sleep in winter. 10, 12, 14 hours. Not always straight through. Medieval people often slept in two segments. First sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. During that middle-of-the-night wake period, you'd lie in darkness. Maybe pray. Maybe talk quietly with your bed partner. Maybe just exist in the black silence. Then back to sleep until dawn. The moon helped when it was full and the sky was clear. Moonlight was precious. A full moon meant you could actually see at night, vaguely, in shades of gray, but enough to navigate. People planned activities around the moon. Travel happened during the bright phase. Harvests were scheduled to use moonlight for extra working hours. But even moonlight couldn't penetrate indoors much. Your house remained dark unless you opened doors and shutters, which in winter meant letting in the cold. So you chose warmth and darkness, or cold with a bit of light. Most chose warmth. Stars were brighter then. Without any competing light, the Milky Way blazed across the sky like a river of luminescence. Medieval people were more familiar with stars than most modern humans. They knew constellations intimately, used them for navigation and timekeeping. But stars don't light the ground. They're beautiful, but they don't help you see where you're walking. You remained functionally blind under even the most glorious starlit sky. Cities weren't much different from villages. Medieval urban centers had no public lighting. Streets were dark channels between buildings. A few wealthy merchants might hang lanterns by their doors, creating tiny islands of light. But most streets were pitch black. Walking through a medieval city at night meant shuffling carefully, hands on walls, hoping you didn't step in something foul. Which you probably would. Remember those open sewers? Crime flourished in darkness. Thieves operated invisibly. Assaults happened without witnesses. Cities tried to enforce curfews. Everyone indoors after dark. Night watchmen patrolled with torches or lanterns, calling the hours, theoretically keeping order. But you can't police what you can't see. The darkness protected criminals as surely as it trapped honest people indoors. And every night, as the sun set, the world contracted. Your existence shrank to the small lit spaces you could afford to maintain. Everything else, the vast majority of the world, simply ceased to exist. Not gone. You knew intellectually that the barn was still there, the road still there, the neighboring houses still there. But experientially, gone. Swallowed by a darkness so complete it might as well have been the void. And you accepted it, because there was no other option. When dawn finally came, bleeding pale light across the horizon, the world reappeared. Like magic, like resurrection. Every single morning. You're 14 years old and newly married. Within a year, you're pregnant. This is expected, celebrated even. Children are wealth, labor, the continuation of your family line. But underneath the celebration, there's fear. Because you know the statistics, even if you don't call them that. You know women who died in childbirth. Your mother's sister. Your neighbor 2 houses down. The baker's young wife. You know them because everyone knows them. Death in childbirth wasn't rare. It was common enough that every woman entered pregnancy knowing she might not survive it. Roughly 1 in 3 women personally knew someone who died giving birth. Think about that ratio. 1 in 3. If you had 2 close friends, one of you would watch someone die this way. The actual maternal mortality rate was staggering by modern standards. Estimates suggest between 1 and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death. That might not sound high until you remember women had 6, 8, 10 pregnancies. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice. By the time you'd had 5 children, your cumulative risk of dying in childbirth approached 10%. 1 in 10 mothers dead, and there was nothing to be done about it. No hospitals, no surgical interventions, no blood transfusions, no antibiotics for infections. When complications arose, you either survived them or you didn't. Labor could last for days. Painful, exhausting days where you pushed and screamed and bled while midwives did what little they could. Sometimes the baby was positioned wrong. Breech births, transverse positions, situations that today would mean an emergency cesarean. In medieval times, they meant almost certain death for the baby and often for the mother too. The midwife would try to turn the baby manually, reaching inside to reposition tiny limbs. Sometimes this worked. Often it didn't. If the baby died in the womb, labor still had to continue. You had to deliver a dead child, knowing it was dead, while your body went through the same agonizing process. And then infection might set in. Retained placenta, tears that wouldn't heal properly, childbed fever, what we now know as puerperal sepsis, caused by bacterial infection in the uterus. You develop a fever within days of giving birth. Chills, abdominal pain, delirium, then death, usually within a week. Historians still argue about how many deaths were preventable with modern knowledge. The answer is most of them, but medieval midwives didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about sterilization. They used the same hands to deliver babies that they'd use to prepare food, tend to animals, handle the dead. Cross-contamination was constant and invisible. One eccentric detail that captures the desperation. Some medieval women wrote their wills when they discovered they were pregnant. Just in case. They'd dictate instructions for their children's care, divide their few possessions, say goodbye in writing to people they might never see again. Then they'd go into labor, hoping those words would never need to be read. Rich women had advantages, but not as many as you'd think. Private chambers for birth, multiple attendants, better nutrition during pregnancy. But when complications struck, money couldn't save you. Noble women died in childbirth at rates not much different from peasants. Their bodies faced the same biological realities. The difference was their deaths were recorded. We know their names, their ages, how many children they left behind. Poor women died in similar numbers, but disappeared into history unnamed. Young mothers faced the highest risk. Girls married at 14, 15, giving birth before their bodies were fully developed. Their pelvises were too small, their systems too immature. First births were especially dangerous, but so were births after the 5th or 6th. Your body wore down, the uterus weakened, complications multiplied. There was no safe zone, just varying levels of risk. And pregnancy itself was dangerous before labor even began. Severe morning sickness could leave you malnourished and weak. Infections, high blood pressure, though they didn't understand what that was. Ectopic pregnancies that ruptured internally. 9 months of vulnerability followed by the most dangerous day of your life. Your husband would wait outside during labor. Men weren't present for births. This was women's work, women's space. Inside, you'd be surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, the midwife. They'd hold you, encourage you, pray with you. And sometimes, if things went wrong, they'd prepare your body for burial while your newborn cried in the next room. Children grew up knowing their mother might die having another baby. They watched their father remarry, often quickly. He needed someone to care for the existing children. The new wife would get pregnant. The cycle continued. Some women survived 5, 6 births successfully, then died on the 7th. Others died with their first. The randomness was almost worse than if there had been a pattern. You couldn't predict it, couldn't prepare for it beyond writing that will and praying. Women supported each other through this. Birth attendants who'd seen dozens of deliveries knew which signs were normal and which meant danger. They had techniques, herbs to strengthen contractions, positions to ease labor, ways to slow bleeding. Some of this helped. Some did nothing. Some possibly made things worse. But they tried because doing nothing felt impossible when someone was dying in front of you. The church offered last rites to laboring women who seemed likely to die. Not after they died, during labor, while they could still respond. Imagine receiving your final confession while contracting, being absolved of your sins between screams. Preparing your soul while your body fought to bring forth life. And if you survived, and most women did survive, that's important to remember. You'd rest for perhaps a week before returning to full work. Your body torn and bleeding, still healing, and you'd be back in the fields or at the spinning wheel because there was no maternity leave. No time to fully recover. Just survival and continuation. Some women went through this 10 times. 10 pregnancies, 10 labors, 10 recoveries. 10 chances to die. And they kept going because what choice was there? Children were necessary. Refusing pregnancy meant refusing marriage, and very few women could survive unmarried. So you accepted the risk. Every woman who married accepted it. Climbing into that marriage bed, knowing that someday you might climb into a birthing bed and never leave it alive. That was just part of being a woman, part of the bargain. Your body in exchange for the possibility of life. And sometimes your body was what the universe collected. Once a year, at minimum, you had to confess your sins. This wasn't optional. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Christians. Miss confession, and you couldn't take communion. Miss communion, and you were essentially excommunicated from the community. So you went. You knelt in the dim church, smelling incense and old stone. The priest sat nearby, close enough to hear your whispered words. And you told him everything. Not just the sins you were proud to admit. Minor transgressions, small lies, moments of anger you'd already forgiven yourself for. But the real sins, the ones that kept you awake at night. The affair with your neighbor's wife. The money you stole from your employer. The hatred you felt for your own child. The time you wished your spouse would die. Every dark thought. Every shameful action. Every secret you'd never told another living soul. The priest heard it all, and he remembered. He couldn't legally reveal what you said in confession. The seal of confession was sacred, enforced by both church law and the threat of eternal damnation. But knowing and revealing are different things. The priest knew who in the village was sleeping with whom. He knew who stole, who lied, who harbored grudges. He knew family secrets going back generations because he'd heard confessions from parents and grandparents before you. He knew which marriages were failing, which merchants cheated their customers, which farmers let their animals damage neighbors' crops. He knew everything. And while he couldn't explicitly reveal what he'd heard in confession, that knowledge shaped how he treated people. A sermon about adultery delivered while looking pointedly at certain parishioners. Advice given to one person that seemed suspiciously informed by another's confession. The subtle redistribution of charity to families the priest knew were struggling with sins of poverty. The priest wielded enormous quiet power. Historians still argue about how often priests actually broke the seal of confession. Some evidence suggests it happened more than the church admitted. Whispers shared with bishops. Information passed to secular authorities when crimes were serious enough. But explicit breaking wasn't even necessary. The power came from the knowledge itself. You couldn't hide from your priest. You couldn't present a false version of yourself. He knew you at your worst because you told him directly. This created a strange intimacy. The priest knew the village better than anyone. He understood the web of relationships, resentments, and secrets that held the community together and tore it apart. One eccentric detail: some medieval people confessed to the same sins repeatedly, year after year. Not because they couldn't stop sinning, though that too, but because confession became a ritual of acknowledging who you were. I lusted after my neighbor. Confess, receive penance. Go home. Lust again next month. Confess again next year. The priest would recognize the pattern. Your particular flavor of sin. The ways you consistently failed to live up to church teachings. And he'd absolve you anyway, because that was his job. But he'd remember. Young people confessed to desires they barely understood. Elderly people confessed to sins from decades ago that still haunted them. Everyone, regardless of age or status, brought their spiritual filth to the same man. The priest became a repository of collective guilt. Every darkness in the village passed through him. Every cruelty, every weakness, every moment of human failure. Imagine carrying that knowledge, being unable to unknow what you'd heard, seeing people on the street and remembering what they'd whispered in the confession box. Some priests broke under the weight of it, turned to drink, became cynical about human nature, lost their faith in the very people they were supposed to shepherd. Others used it to genuinely help, intervening quietly when they knew someone was suffering, guiding people away from destructive patterns, offering compassion to those who thought themselves beyond redemption. But the power imbalance was always there. You were vulnerable before the priest in a way you'd never be before anyone else. You'd given him ammunition against you, even if he'd sworn never to use it. And that created a subtle form of control. Women confessed to sexual thoughts and were told their bodies were sinful. Men confessed to anger and were reminded to submit to authority. Children confessed to disobedience and learned early that rebellion was a spiritual failing. The priest shaped morality not just through sermons, but through these intimate, one-on-one encounters where you were at your most exposed. Rich people confessed too, but their confessions carried different weight. A lord admitting to taking a peasant's land unjustly might receive a gentle penance. Say some prayers, make a small donation to the church. A peasant admitting to stealing a loaf of bread might face harsher spiritual consequences and the priest's stern disapproval. Justice, even spiritual justice, bent toward power. Some priests were corrupt. They'd hint at knowledge from confession to extract bribes. They'd threaten to withhold absolution unless certain favors were granted. The church condemned this, but enforcement was difficult. Who would report a priest who knew all your secrets? Most priests probably tried to be ethical within the system, but the system itself was built on profound inequality of knowledge. The priest knew you completely. You knew nothing of him except what he chose to reveal in his sermons and his public life. That asymmetry defined the relationship. And every time you sinned, and everyone sinned constantly by the church's expansive definition, you knew you'd eventually have to confess it. The priest would know. He'd add it to his mental catalog of your failures. This created a surveillance of the soul. Not cameras watching your actions, but the certainty that your conscience would eventually betray you to authority. You policed yourself because confession was inevitable, and the priest waited, patient and knowing, for you to bring your darkness to him once again. Year after year, sin after sin, he knew the rhythms of your spiritual life better than you did. He knew when you were lying in confession, claiming sins you hadn't committed to seem pious, omitting the ones that shamed you most. He knew the difference between genuine repentance and going through the motions. And he knew that next year, you'd be back, kneeling in the same spot, whispering similar sins, seeking the same absolution, because you had no choice. The church demanded it, and the priest, keeper of secrets, would listen once more, adding your confession to all the others, filing it away in that vast mental archive of human failing, until the village's collective sins became his burden to carry. Alone, in silence, forever. The rooster crowed at dawn like it did every morning. But this morning was different. This morning, the rooster had killed a child. The exact circumstances are recorded in medieval court documents from 1474. A rooster in Basel attacked an infant, pecking aggressively, causing injuries that led to the child's death. The rooster was arrested, not killed immediately as a dangerous animal, not simply disposed of as property. Arrested, formally charged with murder, and put on trial. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval Europe routinely prosecuted animals in formal courts of law with all the procedures reserved for human criminals. Pigs that mauled children, bulls that gored farmers, rats that destroyed crops, insects that damaged vineyards, all faced legal proceedings. The accused animal would be brought before a judge. A lawyer would be appointed to defend it. Yes, defense attorneys for animals. Witnesses would testify. Evidence would be presented. The trial followed the same structure as human trials because, according to medieval legal philosophy, justice must be served regardless of the offender species. If a creature caused harm, it had violated law and order. The law must respond. The Basel rooster's trial lasted several days. The prosecution argued the bird had demonstrated malicious intent through the viciousness of its attack. The defense, and there was a defense, argued that roosters lack moral reasoning and cannot be held responsible for acting according to their nature. The court deliberated. The rooster was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning. The sentence was carried out publicly, with the same ceremony afforded to human executions. Historians still argue about the reasoning behind animal trials. Some suggest it was about maintaining cosmic order. Crime must be punished to restore balance. Others point to the legal theory that animals, as God's creatures with souls, could be morally responsible for their actions. Still others suggest it was purely practical, removing dangerous animals while following proper legal procedure to protect property rights. All three explanations might be partially true. One eccentric detail that reveals the seriousness of these proceedings: defense lawyers could be disciplined or fined for providing inadequate defense of animal clients. The system demanded genuine advocacy. Pigs were the most commonly prosecuted animals. They roamed freely in medieval streets, acting as living garbage disposals. Sometimes they attacked children, especially infants left unattended. When this happened, the pig would be tried for murder. Court records describe pigs being dressed in human clothing for their executions, a strange ritual that emphasized their role as moral agents being punished for crimes. The pig would be led to the gallows wearing a vest and breeches, then hanged like a human criminal. Witnesses attended. The execution was documented. Justice, in the medieval mind, had been served. Insects faced different proceedings. When locusts devastated crops or weevils destroyed stored grain, the affected community could bring a case against the entire species. A representative insect would sometimes be brought to court, captured and placed in a box for the proceedings. The prosecution would detail the damage. The defense would argue for the insect's right to exist and feed themselves. These trials often ended with the court issuing a formal warning to the insects, demanding they leave the area within a specified time frame. If the insects remained past the deadline, the church could excommunicate them. Excommunication of insects. A formal declaration that these creatures were cut off from God's grace. Whether the insects cared is not recorded, but the humans clearly did. The ritual mattered. The proper procedure mattered. One famous case involved a French village prosecuting rats for destroying barley crops. The rat's defense attorney, a man named Bartholomew Chassany, argued brilliantly that his clients could not appear in court because, first, the summons had been improperly served. Rats cannot read legal documents. Second, the rats feared for their safety traveling to court through territory occupied by cats, their natural enemies. Third, there were so many rats that summoning all of them was impractical. The judge, taking these arguments seriously, issued a new summons requiring the rats to appear but guaranteeing safe passage through cat-occupied areas. The rats still didn't show up. Chassany argued this was because the cats had violated the court's safe passage order. The case dragged on for years, ultimately unresolved. Chassany's reputation as a lawyer was enhanced by his skillful defense of rats. Bulls that killed people faced trial and execution. The bull would be paraded through town to the execution site and killed publicly. Sometimes the bull's owner faced legal consequences too, fined for keeping a dangerous animal. But the bull itself had to be formally judged and sentenced. Its death wasn't just practical necessity, it was legal punishment. Dogs that bit people stood trial. Cats accused of being witches' familiars faced prosecution. Even individual trees could be tried if someone died after being struck by a falling branch. The tree would be formally accused. Evidence presented. Then the tree would be cut down as punishment, not just removed but legally executed. This seems absurd to modern minds. How can an animal or plant understand law? How can it form intent or be deterred by punishment? But medieval people operated from different premises. They believe in a divinely ordered world where everything had its place and purpose. When that order was violated, even by an animal, it had to be addressed through the same institutions that maintained order among humans. The trial process served multiple functions. It affirmed human authority over nature. It provided psychological closure to victims' families. It demonstrated that the community took the death seriously. And perhaps most importantly, it maintained the fiction that the world was just and orderly. If even animals could be held accountable, then surely justice existed. Not all animal cases ended in execution. Sometimes animals were acquitted. Defense arguments about lack of intent or acting in self-defense could succeed. A pig might be found not guilty if evidence suggested it was provoked or defending itself. The legal system treated these as genuine questions requiring careful deliberation. The practice continued for centuries. The last known animal trial in Europe occurred in the 1700s, a dog prosecuted for biting someone. By then, Enlightenment thinking was making the practice seem ridiculous. But for hundreds of years before, it had been normal. Just another aspect of medieval justice. Another way of making sense of a world that often made no sense. When a child died and someone needed to be blamed, the rooster stood trial. When crops failed and hunger loomed, the insects were excommunicated. When a bull gored its owner, the bull was hanged. And everyone could believe that justice, in some form, had been done. The rooster couldn't understand the charges against it. But it burned anyway. You've been feeling weak for weeks now. Tired all the time. Pale. Short of breath after the smallest exertion. Your family is worried. They pool their meager resources and take you to the barber surgeon. He examines you briefly, checks your tongue, feels your pulse, studies your complexion. Then he nods knowingly. Your humors are imbalanced, he announces. Too much blood. We need to drain some. He brings out a small, sharp blade called a lancet, and he cuts open your vein. Your blood flows into a basin. Dark red, precious blood that your body created from the food you could barely afford. He drains perhaps a pint, maybe more. You feel dizzy, faint, weaker than before. There, he says, bandaging the wound. You should feel better soon. You don't feel better. You feel worse. But the barber surgeon is the expert. This is medicine. This is healing. So you pay him and go home to rest. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical treatments in medieval Europe, practiced for virtually every ailment imaginable. Fever? Bloodletting. Infection? Bloodletting. Headache? Bloodletting. Depression? You guessed it, bloodletting. The theory came from ancient Greek medicine, specifically the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were balanced. Illness meant they were out of balance. And since blood was the easiest humor to access and remove, bloodletting became the default treatment. Barber surgeons performed the procedure. Actual physicians considered surgery beneath them. They diagnosed and prescribed but didn't cut. So the barbers, who already had sharp blades for shaving, took on the role of bloodletters. The red and white striped barber pole you still see today? That's a remnant of this history. Red for blood, white for bandages. A visual advertisement that this establishment would cut you open for your health. Historians still argue about how many people died from bloodletting itself rather than the illnesses being treated. The practice weakened already sick people. It removed iron-rich blood from anemic patients. It exposed wounds to infection in an era before sterilization. But medieval people believed it worked. They saw doctors do it, prestigious physicians recommended it, ancient texts described it. So it must be effective, right? One eccentric detail: bloodletting was often scheduled according to astrological charts. Certain days were favorable for bleeding, others were dangerous. The moon's phase mattered. Your zodiac sign determined which veins should be opened. A whole elaborate system of timing existed around deliberately making people bleed. The procedure varied. Sometimes they'd cut a vein in your arm, the most common sight. Other times they'd open veins in your neck, behind your ears, under your tongue. The location depended on which organ was supposedly affected. Headaches might mean bleeding from the forehead. Liver problems meant opening veins near the liver. The logic was consistent within its own framework, even if that framework was fundamentally wrong. Leeches offered an alternative method. These blood-sucking worms would be applied to your skin, where they'd attach and feed. Some people found this preferable to being cut. The leeches numbed the area slightly with their saliva, making it less painful than a blade. Plus, the leech would stop feeding on its own once full. It was self-regulating bloodletting. Medieval doctors kept jars of leeches, applying them to patients multiple times daily in severe cases. The leeches would swell grotesquely as they fed, their bodies becoming translucent with your blood. Then they'd drop off, satisfied, and the doctor would apply fresh ones. How much blood was removed depended on the perceived severity of illness. Mild cases might mean half a pint. Serious illnesses could involve removing a quart or more over several sessions. For context, donating blood today involves taking 1 pint, and you're required to rest and eat afterward. Medieval patients often had multiple pints removed while already weak from illness and malnutrition. The results were predictable. People got worse. Some died. But when someone recovered after bloodletting, and some did because not all illnesses are fatal, it confirmed the treatment's effectiveness. When someone died, well, the disease was too advanced. The bloodletting couldn't save them. The treatment was never blamed. This is survivorship bias on a societal scale. The successes were remembered and attributed to the bloodletting. The failures were attributed to the disease. Rich people received bloodletting from the best physicians using the finest instruments. Poor people went to barbers and dirty shops with reused blades. But both rich and poor were subjected to the same fundamentally harmful practice. Medieval royalty died from aggressive bloodletting. Historical records suggest several kings and nobles were bled to death by their own physicians, weak from illness, then further weakened by treatment until their bodies simply gave up. Children were bled too. Even infants in some cases, though there was debate about how young was too young. The prevailing view was that if a child was sick enough, bloodletting might save them. It didn't. It made things worse. But no one realized the treatment itself was the problem. Women were bled during childbirth complications. Already bleeding naturally from labor, they'd have additional blood removed to balance the humors. The hemorrhaging this caused killed many women who might have otherwise survived. Menstruation was considered a natural form of bloodletting. Women's monthly cycles were seen as the body's way of purging excess blood. This meant women supposedly needed less therapeutic bloodletting than men, one of the few ways medieval medicine accidentally protected women from its own harm. Some people developed anemia from repeated bloodletting. Pale, exhausted, unable to work. They'd return to the barber surgeon complaining of continued weakness. He'd examine them and conclude they needed more bloodletting. The cycle continued until the person either stopped seeking treatment or died. Monks and nuns were bled regularly as preventive medicine, 4 times a year, typically aligned with the seasons. This was considered health maintenance. Like going to the dentist, if the dentist deliberately made you sicker each visit, the bloodletting would leave them weak for days. But this was expected. This was part of the process. They'd rest, recover slowly, then resume their duties until the next scheduled bleeding. Not everyone supported the practice. Some medieval physicians questioned whether draining blood from sick people was truly helpful. But these dissenting voices were drowned out by centuries of tradition and institutional support. The treatment continued, generation after generation, century after century. People suffering, people dying, people made worse by the very medicine meant to heal them, and everyone believing it was necessary. That pain and weakness after bloodletting, that was the treatment working. The dizziness, the fatigue, the pale skin, signs of healing, they were told. Signs that the bad blood had been removed and balance was being restored. They believed it because what else could they believe? The alternative was accepting that medicine didn't work. That when you got sick, there was no help, no hope, no expertise that could save you. So they let the barber surgeon cut them open. They watched their blood flow into basins. They felt themselves growing weaker, and they called it healing. The first frost comes in October. By November, the ground is hard. The days grow shorter, colder. The world begins its slow contraction. You're 70 years old, ancient by medieval standards. You've survived plagues, famines, wars. You've buried children, spouses, friends. But this winter feels different. You can feel in your bones, in a way your joints ache more sharply, and how the cold penetrates deeper than before. Winter is coming, and you're not sure you'll see spring. For the medieval poor and elderly, winter was a game of survival with odds that worsened each year. Would your food last? Would your firewood hold out? Would your body endure another season of cold and darkness? Every winter was a question mark. This winter might be your last. The preparation began in autumn, storing every scrap of food you could, gathering wood for the fire, bundle by bundle, knowing it would never be enough, checking the thatch on your roof, stuffing rags into gaps in walls where wind would whistle through. Small defenses against the coming siege. Because winter was a siege. The cold surrounded you, relentless and patient, waiting for your defenses to fail. Food supplies determined everything. Harvest yields from months ago would dictate whether you ate adequately or starved slowly until spring. Medieval people had no refrigeration beyond cool cellars and cold weather itself. Preserved food, dried, salted, smoked, was what you had. Grain stored in barrels. Salted pork hanging from rafters. Root vegetables buried in pits. This was your lifeline. When it ran out, there was nothing else. No grocery stores. No relief agencies. No frozen pizza in a freezer. Just empty bowls and the slow gnawing of hunger while winter continued around you, indifferent. The poor faced impossible calculations. Eat enough to stay strong, and the food runs out early. Rationed severely, and you grow too weak to work, to care for yourself, to survive. Either path could lead to death. You chose and hoped. Firewood was nearly as critical as food. A cold house meant more than discomfort. It meant death from exposure, especially for the elderly and very young. But wood was heavy. Gathering it required strength. Buying it required money most people didn't have. So you made choices. Heat during the day when you could see to work, or save wood for night when the cold bit hardest. Heat the whole house, or just huddle near the hearth. Every log burned was one less for tomorrow. The pile shrank daily. You counted what remained and calculated whether it would last. Often it wouldn't. Historians still argue about winter mortality rates among medieval elderly, but skeletal evidence and historical records suggest many people died in late winter, January through March, when resources were most depleted. They called it the starving time. The months when last year's harvest was nearly gone, and this year's crops were still months from maturity. The gap between depletion and renewal. The valley of death. One eccentric detail: medieval people tracked their age not by years lived, but by winters survived. I've seen 60 winters meant more than I'm 60 years old. It meant you'd endured 60 separate trials, 60 times when you might have died but didn't. Each winter was an achievement. Each spring, a victory. The cold itself killed. Hypothermia crept in slowly when you couldn't maintain adequate heat. Your body temperature dropped degree by degree. First you shivered, then you grew confused, then lethargic, then unconscious, then dead. Medieval people found neighbors frozen in their beds, curled under inadequate blankets, their fires long since gone cold. Old bodies couldn't generate heat efficiently, couldn't shiver hard enough to warm themselves. The cold invaded and stayed. Illness struck harder in winter. Respiratory infections spread through crowded homes where families huddled together for warmth. That cough that started in November became pneumonia by January. Your lungs filled with fluid. You couldn't breathe, couldn't get warm no matter how close to the fire you sat. And there was no treatment, just waiting to see if your body would recover or if this was the illness that would finally claim you. Remember that tooth pain? That joint ache? Those intestinal worms? All of it worse in winter. Everything that hurt already hurt more. Everything weak grew weaker. Your body had to fight on multiple fronts: cold, hunger, illness, age, all at once. Most winters, you'd win. Barely. Emerging in a spring thin and exhausted but alive. But each winter took something from you. A little more strength. A little more resilience. A little more will. Until finally, one winter, You had nothing left to give. The elderly knew this. They felt it. They'd watch winter approaching and wonder if this was their last autumn. Some made peace with it, said their goodbyes, put their affairs in order as much as poor people could. Others fought desperately, rationed more severely, burned less wood, endured more suffering to stretch resources just a bit further. But you couldn't fight forever. Families faced terrible choices. Limited food meant deciding who ate how much. The young needed to survive. They were the future. The old had already lived their lives. Nobody said this explicitly, but everyone understood. Grandfather's portion got smaller. Grandmother insisted she wasn't hungry. Acts of love disguised as preference. Sacrifices made quietly so the young might endure. Some elderly people wandered off into winter storms, just walked away from their families into the cold, never to return. Was it confusion? Despair? A deliberate choice to die away from home so as not to burden their families with their body? Historical records suggest all three happened. The body becomes a burden when resources are scarce. Another mouth to feed. Another person needing warmth. Another source of worry and care. The elderly felt this, knew they were taking resources that might save younger, stronger people. Some bore this guilt through their final winter. Others released themselves from it by releasing themselves from life. Not every old person died in winter. Many survived into spring, saw the snow melt, felt warmth return. But they knew they'd have to do it again next year, and the year after. Each winter harder than the last. Living became a series of hurdles, each one higher, each one requiring more effort to clear, until the hurdle was too high, until winter finally won. Spring would come eventually. It always did. The sun would return, the earth would thaw, green things would grow again. But you wouldn't see it. Your body would be buried in the still cold ground, or sometimes not buried until the earth softened, kept in a shed until the ground could be dug, waiting in death as you'd waited in life. Patient, still, finally at rest. The family you left behind would mourn. They'd also feel a complicated relief. One less mouth to feed next winter. One less person to worry about. Grief and pragmatism intertwined. Love and survival occupying the same space. They'd remember you when spring arrived, when the flowers bloomed that you'd never see, when the first harvest came that you wouldn't share. They'd say you made it through so many winters, survived so much, lived a full life by medieval standards. And they'd prepare for the next winter, knowing that someday they too would face that final cold, that last winter that they wouldn't survive. The cycle continuing, generation after generation, each person waiting their turn, waiting to see if this winter would be the one, if this cold would be their last, if spring would come for them, or if they become another memory, another name spoken when the snow melted. Another person who'd survived 60 winters, but not 61. The wind blows outside. The fire burns low. Your blanket is thin. Your body is tired. So very tired. You close your eyes, and you wait. For spring, or for sleep. Whichever comes first. Sweet dreams.